When I found out that our HOA president had hired a fake police force complete with K-9 units to intimidate residents, I realized I needed to take action quickly. The last thing I wanted was for someone to get hurt. Little did I know that my dad, who was the chief of police, would uncover a serious web of corruption that would shake our entire community. Imagine discovering that the very people who are supposed to protect your neighborhood might actually be criminals. What would you do in that situation? It all started when I got home after a long 12-hour shift at the hospital. I was eager to surprise Sarah by helping her with her new vegetable garden, but my plans quickly changed. Hanging on my front door was a bright orange notice that caught my eye. My heart raced as I read the words, "Immediate action required," stamped in bold black letters. I had heard whispers about Barbara Thompson, our HOA president, from other neighbors. She had moved in just 6 months ago and managed to get herself elected within weeks. The way she had written our address on that violation notice, pressing her pen so hard that it almost tore through the paper, said a lot about her character. The notice stated that unapproved landscaping modifications detected in our backyard, demanding immediate removal. It also mentioned that all garden installations must go through the proper HOA review process. Barbara's signature sprawled across the bottom like she was issuing a grand command, but the last line made my stomach drop. Security will conduct regular inspections to ensure compliance. Since when did our quiet suburban community need security checks for vegetable gardens? Sarah and I had chosen this neighborhood just 3 months ago, drawn in by the friendly neighbors and peaceful streets. Mrs. Patterson, who lives next door, had even welcomed us with homemade cookies. Now, things felt completely different. I quickly pulled out my phone and took pictures of both sides of the notice. The wording felt off to me, almost as if it were trying too hard to sound official. Coming from the son of a police chief, I knew the importance of documenting everything just in case. Inside the house, I found Sarah humming away in the kitchen, her hands still dirty from working in our little garden. Her smile faded when I handed her the notice. "But we checked the HOA guidelines," she said, pulling up the community website on her tablet. "Right here, Article 7, Vegetable Gardens." In our backyard, we had made sure to follow all the guidelines for planting, including proper drainage. As I watched, Sarah marked the important sections, her instincts as an environmental lawyer kicking in. We felt confident. We had installed everything correctly, kept our garden neat, and even stuck to the recommended height for our raised beds. If you've made it this far and are enjoying the drama of these HOA stories, you're not alone. Don't miss out on the rest of the story. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for even more shocking twists. From outside our yard, the tomato plants were barely noticeable. Suddenly the doorbell rang, causing us both to jump. Peering through the peephole, I noticed Barbara standing on our welcome mat, tapping her foot impatiently. She was dressed in a sharp white pantsuit, likely costing more than what I earned in a month, and held her tablet tightly, as if it were a tool for battle. "I want to make sure you received my notice," she declared as I opened the door, skipping any pleasantries. Her gaze quickly darted past me, trying to catch a glimpse of the inside of our house. "The board has received complaints about your agricultural activities." "Could I see those complaints?" I asked, trying to stay calm and remembering my dad's advice to remain professional in tense moments. "And could you clarify which specific HOA guidelines we violated?" Barbara's expression tightened. "Our new security team will be documenting all violations starting tomorrow. I suggest you comply quickly to avoid complications." With that, she turned on her heel, but not before I noticed something unusual. A logo on her tablet case that looked a lot like a police badge. As I shut the door, I saw Sarah already diving into property maps and local ordinances on her laptop. "Look at this," she whispered, pointing to the minutes from last month's HOA board meeting. "They never even voted on hiring a security team. Where is she getting this authority?" I found myself staring out our kitchen window at the neat rows of vegetables Sarah had lovingly planted. It felt like something larger was unfolding, and that orange notice was just the tip of the iceberg. I thought about calling Dad, but hesitated. Maybe it was too early to involve him. Still, as I watched Barbara stride down our street, taking photos of other homes with her tablet, an unsettling feeling settled in. Our quiet community seemed on the brink of change. Then, as I sipped my morning coffee, I spotted two men in black polo shirts with HOA security emblazoned on the back through the kitchen window. They were snapping photos of our vegetable garden, but their demeanor was different from regular inspectors. More assertive, more deliberate. The tactical belts they wore were loaded with equipment, intensifying my unease. It was early in the morning when I stepped onto our back porch, and I noticed two men in what looked like real police gear. Sarah was still asleep upstairs, so I approached them, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing unease in my stomach. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" I asked. The taller one responded confidently, his hand resting on what seemed to be a genuine police taser. Meanwhile, his partner was taking pictures of our tomato plants as if they were evidence in a crime scene. "We have police authority within this community," he said, flashing a badge that was gone before I could get a good look at it. "We're documenting ongoing violations under HOA Code 47B. He spoke like someone who was used to being taken seriously, but I wasn't so sure. I pulled out my phone and began recording, which seemed to make them uncomfortable. "I'd like to see your credentials and documentation of this police authority," I said, recalling a legal rights pamphlet I had read recently. Just as I spoke, the shorter man stepped forward, but the taller one held him back, a sign that I was getting under their skin. At that moment, Barbara Thompson made her entrance, striding across our lawn in her designer workout gear. She waved another orange violation notice and declared, "These officers don't answer to residents. They report directly to the HOA Executive Board, which means they report to me." I caught a glimpse of our neighbor, Mrs. Patel, peeking through her curtains. When our eyes met, she quickly disappeared, but not before I noticed the fear on her face. That look unsettled me. Later that morning, as I reviewed the footage from my phone, I began to notice things I had missed. The officers had no name tags, their badges did not match any local law enforcement I was familiar with, and the way their equipment was positioned looked wrong. I spent my lunch break researching private security regulations in our state. I learned that every legitimate company needed specific licenses and permits, particularly if they carried weapons. Although the HOA newsletter mentioned hiring enhanced security, I found no company names, no license numbers, nothing that could be verified. Just then, Sarah came downstairs, her voice tight with worry, as she asked, "Why are there men with guns taking pictures of our garden?" I showed her the footage from that morning, and I could see her face go pale. "Those aren't regular security guards," she said. "I used to work at a security company, remember?" As we watched from our windows, the officers moved methodically down the street, stopping at each house with careful attention. They lingered a bit longer at the homes of residents who had recently voiced concerns at HOA meetings. The Rodriguez family, who had raised issues about unfair noise regulations, and the Smiths, who questioned the new monthly security fees, seemed to attract special scrutiny. That evening, I set up a group chat with a few trusted neighbors. Almost immediately, messages began to flood in. It appeared that the security team had been entering backyards without permission. They had taken photos of children playing and even threatened to detain someone for simply washing their car in their own driveway. As I gathered everyone's stories and evidence, a text from Barbara popped up. "Your ongoing observation of our security team violates HOA policy. Expect enforcement action tomorrow." The threat was unmistakable. However, Barbara had made a critical mistake in trying to intimidate us. She confirmed what we had suspected. These men were not genuine police officers. I glanced at Sarah, who was already researching state laws about impersonating law enforcement. "We need to be very careful," she said quietly. "If they're willing to pretend to be cops, who knows what else they might do." The growing pile of evidence on our kitchen table hinted that we were only beginning to uncover the full story of what was happening in our neighborhood. During an important work meeting, my phone buzzed with Sarah's name flashing on the screen. She never calls during work hours, so I knew something was wrong. I stepped outside, feeling uneasy as I answered. "They're in our backyard," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "There are 3 of them. They jumped the fence while I was picking tomatoes." I heard angry male voices in the background, and my heart raced. Ma'am, this is your final warning. Exit the garden now, one voice said, trying to sound authoritative, but something about it felt off. We have authorization to remove you by force. I'm not leaving my own property, Sarah replied firmly, but I could sense the fear in her voice. Show me your real police badges or leave now. Then the sound of a radio crackled to life, sending a wave of panic through me. Unit 2, subject is non-compliant. Requesting K-9 backup at 1242 Maple Drive. Without thinking, I sprinted to my car, my tie flapping in the wind. Sarah, I'm on my way. Don't move. Call 911 right now. These aren't real cops. As I drove home, I could hear Barbara's sharp voice coming through my phone. Mrs. Williams, your garden is violating HOA Aesthetic Guidelines, Section 4.3. My security team has the authority to remove unauthorized plants and trespassers, she said. On the other end, Sarah's voice was rising in disbelief. I live here, and those tomato plants are in our backyard. I quickly switched to speaker mode, my foot hitting the gas harder. Each noise made my heart race, like the click of a weapon being unfastened and the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. Barbara continued with her list of violations. Look what I found, one of the security men called out. Hispanic-style peppers, definitely not approved. They're jalapenos, Sarah cried in frustration. Since when do vegetables have ethnic restrictions? I heard the creak of our garden gate, the one I had just installed last weekend. More boots were digging through our plants. Stop touching our property, Sarah shouted, anger rising in her voice. My husband's already called the real police. Barbara's laugh was chilling. Dear, we are the police in this community. The HOA charter gives us full authority. Step aside, or my men will remove you. In the distance, I heard a dog bark. The thought of K-9 units being brought in for a vegetable dispute sent a shiver down my spine. I changed lanes quickly, squeezing through traffic despite the angry honks around me. 5 more minutes, I thought. Barbara's voice was relentless. First the unapproved plants, then the unauthorized garden stakes, and now resisting HOA security. You people need to learn respect for authority. You people? Sarah's voice was quiet but determined, and I heard the familiar click of her phone camera. Please say that again, Barbara. I'm recording everything. Suddenly, there were sounds of scuffling. Barbara gasped. Confiscate that phone. It's against HOA policy to record security operations. I winced as I heard Sarah scream, the phone clattering to the ground but still connected. The tension was palpable as I heard the rumbling growl of a large dog approaching. Barbara Thompson, Sarah shouted. If that dog touches me, you'll be in handcuffs. I was just 2 blocks away when I finally heard sirens, but they were not from the local police. A black SUV marked with K-9 unit signage screeched to a stop in front of our house. The situation was escalating, but what they didn't know was that they were about to encounter a real chief of police. Gripping the steering wheel tightly, I felt my knuckles turn white as I raced home. As I drove down our street, I couldn't help but notice a gathering of neighbors, all with their phones raised, recording what was unfolding. It seemed like Barbara's security team had crossed a line, and everyone was eager to capture the moment. Skidding into our driveway, I was struck by a scene that made my heart race. There was Sarah, backed up against our front door, dirt smudged on her cheek from gardening, with 3 men in tactical gear surrounding her. Barbara stood nearby, clipboard in hand, scribbling away. What truly sent a shiver down my spine was the German Shepherd tugging hard on its leash, teeth bared, while its handler, a young man who looked barely of age, struggled to keep control. This looked serious. These weren't just overzealous security guards anymore. Step back inside your vehicle, sir, one of the officers barked, trying to sound official. I noticed his hand was resting on what appeared to be a police belt, but something felt off about his badge. Having grown up around real police equipment thanks to my dad, I could tell this wasn't the real deal. When Barbara spotted me, her face lit up with that all-too-familiar smug smile. "Perfect timing," she exclaimed. "Your wife has been interfering with official HOA security operations." She waved her clipboard as if it were a royal decree. "We have documented 17 violations, including aggressive behavior toward our officers." I took out my phone to start recording, and Barbara's confident smile faltered for a moment. "Putting unauthorized recordings on social media is against HOA guidelines," she snapped, though I could sense the worry creeping into her tone. I maintained a steady voice, just like Dad had taught me. Funny thing about those guidelines, I've read them from cover to cover. Nowhere does it mention anything about private police forces or K-9 units. I noticed the youngest officer shift uncomfortably, his hand dropping from his belt. Sarah caught my eye, and I gave her a slight nod. She had been recording too, her phone partially hidden by her gardening apron. We discussed this possibility after the first time these officers had shown up, and our security cameras were now capturing everything from multiple angles. "This is your final warning," Barbara declared, but her tone lost some of its sharpness. "Remove the unauthorized vegetables immediately, or we will be forced to take additional enforcement action." The German Shepherd barked, causing Sarah to jump, and that's when I realized something crucial. I felt a surge of frustration when I spotted the dogs wearing vests labeled Police K-9. It didn't sit right with me, especially since they weren't real law enforcement. I could almost hear my dad's voice listing the laws being broken. "Barbara," I said calmly, pulling up the state police department's website on my phone. "Did you know that impersonating law enforcement officers is a felony? Those uniforms and fake badges? Each one comes with its own set of charges." The security team exchanged worried glances, and I noticed the handler's grip on the leash tightening, his knuckles turning white. Barbara's face reddened, but she continued writing on her clipboard, seemingly using it as a shield. "We have full authority to enforce HOA regulations," she insisted, though her voice trembled. I reached into my car to retrieve a folder I had been organizing. "Actually, I have the minutes from every board meeting over the past year right here. Nowhere in those records is there a mention of hiring armed security or approving K-9 units." Turning to the youngest officer, I asked, "By the way, what's your certification number for handling that police dog?" I noticed the handler's face turning pale, and the German Shepherd began whining as it sensed the tension. Barbara's pen froze mid-sentence, clearly rattled. "Sarah," I called out, keeping my gaze focused on the security team, "could you grab Dad's card from my wallet? I think he'd really like to see these gentlemen's credentials." That's when Barbara made a critical error. "Detain them both," she shrieked, her clipboard clattering to the ground. "They're threatening HOA personnel." My hands shook so much that I almost dropped my phone, but I managed to send a quick text to my dad. "Emergency at house. Fake cops threatening Sarah with dog. Please help." I kept the phone low, pretending to check my work schedule, while Barbara continued her rant about our garden allegedly violating some made-up rule about aesthetics. Meanwhile, the lead security guy kept a tight hold on the German Shepherd's harness, clearly trying to show how eager the dog was to leap forward. Sarah held her ground, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She had been bitten by a dog as a child and still had a lingering dread. That's exactly what these bullies were relying on. I checked my phone every few seconds, trying to be discreet. When I saw the 3 dots indicating that Dad was typing, my heart raced. After 20 years as chief of police, he had dealt with every type of scam and power play imaginable, but this felt personal. She was getting louder, waving an official-looking document in Sarah's face. "According to Section 8, Paragraph 12 of our Enhanced Security Protocols," she started, but I interrupted her. "Could you show me where the HOA board approved these protocols?" I asked calmly. This caught her off guard. The security team leader, who had a badge that read Captain Reynolds, stepped forward. "Sir, you're interfering with a sanctioned HOA operation," he growled, allowing his dog to move closer. I noticed his hand was trembling slightly. They seemed like amateurs playing dress-up, which, in a way, made them even more dangerous. Then, from a distance, I heard the faint sound of sirens. Barbara was too busy reading from her rule book to pay attention, but Captain Reynolds heard them immediately. His posture changed. The other 2 security personnel began fidgeting, and one of them touched his earpiece, likely just for show since real radio equipment was probably beyond their budget. "Maybe we should," he started to say, but Barbara cut him off, spinning around. "Don't you dare back down. I'm paying you good money to show these people who's in charge." It was at that moment that the first real police car turned the corner, lights flashing, followed by another, and then another. The look on Barbara's face was unforgettable as 5 patrol cars surrounded my house, effectively cutting off any escape route. The German Shepherd, sensing a shift in authority, sat down and whined. Dad emerged from the lead car, and I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. He wasn't in his usual business suit. Instead, he wore his full chief of police uniform, badge shining. Clearly, he had been in a meeting when he got my text, but he didn't take long to respond. "Barbara Thompson," he called out, his voice strong and commanding, a tone developed over decades of police work. "I'm Chief Anderson. Would you care to explain why you have unauthorized personnel impersonating law enforcement officers on private property?" Barbara's face transformed through a series of emotions in a matter of seconds. Confusion, recognition, fear, anger, and finally, panic. She glanced at me, then at my dad, and back at me as the pieces started to fit together in her mind. The security team tried to retreat, but Dad's officers had already formed a perimeter. The German Shepherd, proving it had more sense than its handlers, lay down and rolled over, tail wagging at the real police K-9 unit that had just arrived. "I can explain everything," Barbara stammered, but Dad raised a hand to stop her. "I'm sure you can, ma'am. We'll have time to discuss that later at the station, but right now, I'm curious about where these men obtained their equipment and credentials." He glanced at the fake security team, noting, "Those badges look quite similar to real police identification. That's a serious offense." As Dad's officers began taking statements and gathering evidence, neighbors started to emerge from their homes, some even recording the scene. Barbara's reign of fear was beginning to fall apart, and the entire community was witnessing it. I drew Sarah closer, sensing her relief as the real police took over the situation. "Your dad," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "He didn't just bring backup, he brought justice." The sound of police sirens broke the tension as Dad's cruiser arrived, lights flashing. Barbara's confident smirk quickly faded when she spotted the chief of police emblem on the door. I still remember how her expression shifted from assured to horrified in an instant. Dad stepped out, his police uniform glistening in the afternoon light, and the fake security team's German Shepherd suddenly became quiet, as if it recognized real authority. After 20 years as chief of police, Dad carried a presence that no fake badge could rival. "I'd like to see your security licenses and K-9 unit certifications," Dad stated calmly, his voice clear across our yard. The 3 security officers exchanged nervous glances as their tough facade began to crumble. The one holding the dog's leash started to back away, while Barbara jumped in, waving a folder of papers. "We have all the necessary HOA authorizations right here," she insisted, her voice higher than usual. "These officers have every right to enforce our community guidelines." Dad took the folder but didn't open it. Instead, he pulled out his phone and showed Barbara something on the screen. "Interesting," he remarked, "because according to state records, there's no licensed security company registered under your HOA's name. And that K-9 unit? The nearest authorized police dog training facility hasn't certified any private security dogs in 2 years." Barbara's face lost all color. The leader of the security team, a tall man with a buzz cut who had seemed so imposing moments ago, now couldn't meet anyone's gaze. As 2 real police officers approached him, I noticed his hand tremble while he tried to maintain his grip on the leash. "Sir," one of Dad's officers addressed him, "that's department-issued gear you're wearing. Can you explain how you came to have it?" The security team leader stayed quiet, beads of sweat visible on his forehead as more neighbors gathered on their porches, watching the unfolding situation. I noticed several phones recording everything. Sarah squeezed my hand, while Dad approached the security team's car, shining his flashlight through the windows. "What do we have here?" he called out. Inside, we saw folders filled with photographs, dozens of images of families in their backyards, kids playing, neighbors just going about their lives. My stomach dropped as I realized how long they had been watching us. In the midst of the chaos, Barbara tried to sneak away, but a young officer stepped in her way. "Ma'am, impersonating a law enforcement officer is a serious offense," he said, "and using an unauthorized K-9 unit to intimidate civilians, that's going to need some explaining." The dog, sensing its handler's tension, shifted from aggressive to unsure. A real K-9 unit soon arrived, and the contrast was undeniable. The HOA's dog lacked the training and discipline of a professional police dog. Dad turned to the growing crowd of neighbors. If anyone has had encounters with these individuals, we would like to hear your statements. Hands shot up across the street. The Rodriguez family from next door stepped forward first, followed by the Patels from across the street. They threatened to report my kids for playing basketball in our driveway, Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and relief as the real police officers began taking statements. I watched Barbara as she sank into the back of a patrol car, still clinging to her HOA rulebook. Meanwhile, the security team was being cuffed, their fake badges and gear being confiscated. Their German Shepherd, now revealed to be just an untrained dog meant to scare people, was gently led away by a real K-9 officer. Sarah walked over to Dad and gave him a tight hug, whispering a quiet thank you. Dad nodded, but I could see the anger in his eyes as he flipped through more of the surveillance photos from the security team's car. Just then, a news van pulled up at the end of our street. Barbara spotted it through the patrol car window and finally broke down in tears. Not tears of regret, but of someone facing the consequences of their actions. Real justice was about to unfold, and I could feel that our once peaceful community was about to change forever as more neighbors came forward to share their stories. It became clear that this situation extended beyond just our home and garden. It was about confronting those who hide behind false authority and fabricated rules. The morning after the arrests, my dad called me into his office at the police station. On his desk lay numerous documents, financial records from the Homeowners Association, security contracts, and countless photographs of our neighbors. I felt a knot in my stomach when I noticed pictures of children playing and families enjoying meals on their porches, all taken during round-the-clock surveillance. "Son, this is more complicated than we initially thought," my dad said, sliding a document toward me. It was a bank statement showing monthly payments of $115,000 to a company called Community Guardian Services. In contrast, the actual HOA budget only allocated $2,000 for security expenses. Where was all that extra money coming from? We continued to sift through the documents, and I quickly discovered that Barbara had been charging extra fees to families who received violation notices. The more we uncovered, the clearer it became that the situation was worsening. For instance, the Rodriguez family had paid $3,000 in security deposits after an incident during their birthday party, while the Patels faced additional maintenance fees for their vegetable garden. The background checks of the so-called security team revealed even more troubling information. None of them had legitimate law enforcement training. Their leader, Mike Stevens, had been dismissed from 3 different police departments due to excessive force. Surprisingly, the K-9 unit wasn't even a properly trained police dog. It was Stevens's personal pet used to intimidate residents. Just then, my phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. She had been talking to Mrs. Patel, who shared videos of the security team rummaging through her mailbox last month. Other neighbors began sending in evidence too, footage from doorbell cameras, cell phone videos, and written threats from Barbara. Each new piece of information intensified my anger. Then, my dad's detective, Lisa Martinez, burst into the office holding a document. "Chief, we found their training manual. The pages outline strategies for targeting specific residents, detailing when to photograph families, and even scripts for intimidating those who dared to challenge their authority." Barbara's handwritten notes in the margins showed that this was not simply about security. It was about control. As our investigation unfolded, we learned that Barbara had a troubling history of abuse of power. She had orchestrated similar schemes in 2 other communities before moving to ours, and had always left just as residents began to question the missing funds. This time, however, she didn't anticipate the consequences of crossing a police chief's family. As the afternoon wore on, reporters made their way to the station, and Dad took charge of the press conference while I assisted Detective Martinez in organizing evidence for the district attorney. It was during this process that we stumbled upon a troubling discovery: encrypted emails revealing that Barbara had been sharing our neighbors' personal information with outside companies. She was selling data about their daily lives and vulnerabilities. The real HOA board members were taken aback. They had trusted Barbara to manage the day-to-day operations, completely unaware of the fake security force she had created or the missing funds. One board member broke down in tears when she realized she had unknowingly signed blank checks, which Barbara used to finance her scheme. As evening approached, more residents began to come forward with their stories. It turned out that the security team had been demanding cash payments to overlook violations. Some elderly residents were even threatened with eviction. It was shocking to hear how they photographed teenage girls at the community pool and followed children home from school. Each new account was more heartbreaking than the last. I found myself in Dad's office late into the night, helping to sort evidence. The final document we uncovered was a draft of Barbara's newest plan to install cameras inside people's homes under the guise of compliance monitoring. She had already ordered the equipment using HOA funds. Just as we were preparing to leave, Dad's phone rang. The FBI wanted to take over the case. Barbara's operation extended beyond our community, linking to similar schemes across 3 states. What began as a simple HOA issue had revealed a nationwide criminal enterprise targeting neighborhoods. Looking at the mountain of evidence on Dad's desk, I couldn't help but think about Sarah in our garden, the Patels nurturing their vegetables, and all the neighbors who had lived in fear. Barbara hadn't just broken the law, she had shattered our community's trust. Yet as I read through more resident statements, I realized something important. By banding together to put a stop to her actions, our neighborhood had become stronger than before. Then, my neighbor Tom leaned in and whispered, "You need to see this." He pulled out his phone, and my heart sank as I watched shaky footage of Barbara's security team surrounding the Rodriguez family's birthday party last month. In the video, children cried as police dogs circled their bounce house, while Barbara loomed in the background with a satisfied smirk. Before long, more neighbors began to gather on our lawn, each bringing their own evidence. Mrs. Patterson, an 80-year-old widow, showed us photos of security guards peering through her windows at night, claiming they were checking for unauthorized decorations. It was clear we had all been affected. Her hands trembled as she shared how frightened she was, even to tend to her flowers. The Patels produced a detailed diary, filled with records of daily harassment, photographs, false claims, and even threats regarding their vegetable garden. They explained that growing an abundance of tomatoes was allegedly against the rules. Mr. Patel's voice was laced with frustration as he recounted, "We've lived here for 20 years, but last month they started calling our curry cooking a public nuisance." As my dad's officers moved through the crowd, gathering statements and evidence, Barbara appeared to shrink more with each story. Her complexion paled as the security team stood nearby, their fake badges and real weapons displayed on the hood of a patrol car for photographs. A group chat had sprung up, filled with photos and videos detailing Barbara's aggressive behavior. The Jackson family had captured footage of the security team measuring their lawn with rulers at 6 a.m., while the Kowalskis shared emails in which Barbara threatened to place liens on their house because of a basketball hoop that had been in their yard for 15 years. "Check this out," my dad said, pointing to a document on his laptop. It revealed that Barbara had been secretly paying the security team from a hidden HOA account. The amount was astonishing, over $200,000 in just 6 months. No wonder our community pool hadn't been repaired. Just then, a news van pulled over, drawn by the sight of all the patrol cars. Barbara tried to shield her face, but her striking red power suit made her hard to miss. As the reporter began interviewing neighbors, more people drove in from nearby streets. Surprisingly, it turned out that Barbara's security team had been harassing individuals beyond our HOA's boundaries. The Martinez family from 2 blocks away showed footage of the team attempting to issue citations to them, even though they were not part of our HOA. They had been threatened with arrest because their teenage son was skateboarding, which the team deemed suspicious. My dad pulled me aside, his expression serious. "This is worse than we thought," he said quietly. "They have warrants in 3 counties for similar scams. They target communities with HOA presidents who crave power, convince them they need extra security, and then exploit that authority to case houses for robberies. As the sun began to set, our street resembled a block party, if block parties included police evidence technicians and news reporters. Neighbors who had never spoken before were finally connecting over shared experiences. As everyone hugged and cried together, Sarah served cold drinks, and the Rodriguez kids were finally able to wrap up their interrupted birthday party. This time, real police officers even joined in, singing along with the celebration. Meanwhile, Barbara sat alone in the back of a patrol car, watching her carefully built kingdom fall apart. Her phone buzzed repeatedly. Likely the actual HOA board members were reacting to what they were about to see on the evening news. They would probably involve lawyers and initiate investigations, but for the first time in years, our neighborhood felt like a true community again. Looking around at all the smiling faces and hearing people share their stories made me realize that Barbara's biggest mistake wasn't just the fraud or the fake security force. It was breaking the trust we had in each other. My dad often said that real security comes not from badges and uniforms, but from neighbors looking out for one another. My hands trembled as I watched the genuine police officers put handcuffs on Barbara. Her face shifted from its usual angry red to a ghostly white when they read her rights. The members of her fake security team attempted to flee, but my dad's officers swiftly blocked all exits from the neighborhood. One even tried hiding in Mrs. Patterson's rose bushes, which did not end well for anyone involved, especially not the Roses. The next morning, our street was crowded with news vans. Reporters were shocked to learn that an HOA president had created an illegal police force. My phone buzzed with messages from friends sharing links to the story. Local HOA president arrested for running fake police operation was trending on every local news site. Dad organized a community meeting at the police station. One by one, our neighbors stood to tell their stories. The Rodriguez family shared videos of the fake officers threatening their kids for playing basketball after 6 p.m. The Patels showed photos of the security team issuing fake tickets for their mailbox height that didn't adhere to regulations. Each story added weight to the charges against Barbara, but the most surprising revelation came from the police forensic accountant. Barbara hadn't just hired illegal security. She had misappropriated over $200,000 from our HOA funds to finance her private army. That money should have gone towards fixing the community pool and maintaining the playground, but instead, it was used for tactical gear and that poor German Shepherd. Speaking of the dog, we all felt a lump in our throats when the real K-9 unit officer shared how they had rescued him. He had been mistreated and neglected, but now he was safe. He was now in a special program focused on rehabilitation, with the hope of one day becoming a real police dog. Last week, my dad took me to visit him at the training center, and I could see how much happier he was. At our recent Homeowners Association, HOA meeting, the district attorney spoke about the charges facing Barbara and her fake officers: impersonation of law enforcement, fraud, theft, intimidation, and violations of civil rights. Some neighbors gasped when they heard Barbara could be sentenced to up to 15 years in prison. I briefly felt a pang of sympathy for her until I remembered how she had upset Sarah. Then something remarkable happened. People began sharing their old violation notices. We laid them out on tables in the community center, and a clear pattern emerged. Barbara had targeted certain families more than others, particularly those of color and anyone who had questioned her authority. The DA's eyes lit up at this evidence of discrimination. The local newspaper picked up the story, informing the public about how communities can safeguard themselves against HOA abuse. They even interviewed my dad about the warning signs of fake security forces and quoted Sarah on the importance of standing up to bullies, no matter what titles they claim. The reporter mentioned our vegetable garden, the very issue that had sparked all this trouble, as an example of reasonable homeowner rights. Last night marked the first HOA board election since Barbara's arrest. The meeting room was packed, and even those who had never attended before came to vote. This time, the conversation shifted away from lawn height regulations and mailbox colors. Instead, people discussed ideas for improving the community and making our neighborhood more welcoming. The new board's first action was to establish a residents' Bill of Rights. No more surprise inspections, no more harassment, no more fake security forces. As I watched my neighbors sign the document, I realized something significant had changed. People were no longer afraid. They were talking, laughing, and planning block parties and community projects. Barbara's lawyer tried to make a deal, but the evidence was overwhelmingly against her. The DA noted that our community had set a precedent for the state. New laws were being proposed to prevent HOA overreach and protect homeowners' rights. Sarah even received an invitation to testify at the state capitol about our experience. When we left the courthouse after Barbara's plea hearing, my dad put his arm around my shoulders and asked, "Do you know what the best kind of justice is?" People coming together can create a strong sense of community, rather than dividing it. I'll never forget seeing our neighbors embracing and shedding joyful tears on the courthouse steps. One misty Monday morning, I watched Barbara, the former HOA president, supervise the loading of her beloved lawn ornaments into moving trucks. These were the very items she once used to file countless complaints against her neighbors. It was striking to see how much she had changed. Her face bore the marks of time since her arrest, and the confident demeanor she once displayed had diminished. A news alert buzzed on my phone. Former HOA president pleads guilty in private security scandal. This story had captured national attention, prompting investigations into similar HOA issues across the country. My dad mentioned that police chiefs from 3 states had contacted him for guidance on tackling these cases. Just then, Sarah came outside with 2 cups of coffee, a smile on her face. "Remember when we were afraid to drink coffee in our own front yard?" she asked. It was hard to believe that just a year ago, Barbara's security team would have reprimanded us for simply relaxing on our property. In place of Barbara's ornamental lawn, our community garden was thriving. Mrs. Patterson, who once reported neighbors for cooking ethnic foods, was now trading her homegrown tomatoes for Mrs. Patel's curry recipes. The Rodriguez kids, who used to run inside when security drove by, were now teaching everyone how to grow the best jalapenos. My dad visited every Sunday, not as the police chief, but as a proud father and grandfather-to-be. Sarah's baby bump was beginning to show, and the thought of raising our child in this new, supportive community filled me with optimism. Neighbors who once lived in fear of one another were now bringing us baby clothes and sharing parenting tips. The newly formed Homeowners Council met in the community center, where Barbara's wall of shame, once full of violation notices, had been replaced by photos celebrating neighborhood events. Sarah, leading her first meeting as council president, introduced a bold idea, using our budget for community programs instead of security patrols. Last week, a documentary crew interviewed us about how much had changed. They captured moments from our monthly block party, where Officer Rodriguez, a real police officer, played basketball with the kids while parents grilled and exchanged stories. The producer was astonished that this vibrant community was the same one she'd read about in the news. Barbara's old security office has become a community resource center. The gun safes and surveillance equipment have given way to books, board games, and a cozy coffee station. The only uniforms you'll see inside now are those worn by our community service volunteers, easily recognized by their bright yellow neighbor helper vests. Just yesterday, I discovered an envelope in our mailbox. Inside was a letter from Barbara's daughter, who had relocated her mother to a smaller house in another state. She wrote, "Mom's starting therapy. Watching your community heal helped her realize she needs to heal too." Also included was a photo of Barbara at her new home, beaming as she tended to her small garden, her first genuine smile in years. Standing here now, watching families move into our neighborhood, I reflect on how close we came to losing everything that makes community living meaningful. Sarah squeezes my hand as we observe children from various backgrounds playing freely in their front yards. There are no security cars in sight. The only sirens we hear are from the ice cream truck. The person checking in on homes these days is Mrs. Patel, delivering her famous homemade naan to new neighbors. Our neighborhood's journey made the cover of Community Living magazine this month, with the headline, "From Fear to Family, How One Neighborhood Overthrew Tyranny and Found True Security and Unity." Yet the real story extends beyond the pages of a magazine. It's in the laughter from the community garden, the aromas of multicultural potluck dinners, and the sight of neighbors helping one another. No badges required. Dad often puts it best when new residents ask about our security system. The best security isn't found in cameras or guards. It's in knowing and caring about your neighbors. As I watch the sun set over our transformed community, I realize that while Barbara's biggest fear came true with the loss of control, in that very loss, we discovered something far more valuable: the freedom to be neighbors in the truest sense of the word.